Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's community conversation. Today, we will be discussing gambling and social media, the risks and opportunities with Dr. Mark Vandermaas. And we will be beginning shortly. We're just going to wait another moment or two to see if anybody else is trying to get connected, and then we'll start. So just sit back and we will begin shortly. And for those who are watching on Facebook today, on the NASW New Jersey Facebook page, welcome to those tuning in. And if you have questions for the presenter during the presentation, if it's live, you can put them in the Facebook chat and we will transfer those over to the main comments in the Zoom webinar. So thank you all again for being here, and we'll get started in just a moment or two. Okay, in the interest of time, let's get started. If anybody else comes in, they can join us in progress. So welcome again to today's community conversation. My name is Jeff Feldman. I am the Director of Advocacy and Communications here at NASW New Jersey, and I will be the moderator for today's conversation. Today, we are joined by Dr. Mark Vandermaas from the Rutgers University Center for Gambling Studies. Mark will be talking to us today about gambling and social media, the risks and opportunities. Before we begin, just a couple of housekeeping items. Please note that this program is being recorded for future use and will be available on the NASW New Jersey YouTube page after the presentation. We'll also be sending a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the program slides to everyone who registered in advance. So even if you're not here right now or join late, hopefully you are able to watch the recording of the presentation at a later time. And lastly, as we are recording, please just make sure to keep yourself on mute so we can avoid interruptions. And if you do unmute yourself to speak, please just make sure that you speak in a professional manner and that you don't share any specific client information or anything else that may be identifying if you have a question about a specific case. With that being said, I'm very happy to welcome Mark and to turn the program over to you. Thanks for being with us today.
Great. Yeah, my pleasure to be here. See, we have a nice intimate group here. Hopefully we're reaching a good number of people on Facebook as well. Welcome all. Thank you for the introduction, Jeff. I suppose I will just get to it. So basically, the title of the talk today is Gambling and Social Media, Risk and Opportunities. To start, just going to give you a little bit of background on some kind of foundational facts here today. So first, I'm sure you're aware of how rapidly gambling is growing right now in the US. This is a worldwide trend, but it's particularly fast here in America. And it's being driven by three kind of major factors here. First are improving technologies that make it much easier to deliver gambling on web and mobile apps. Right? This means that now people will have gambling available in their pocket 24/7 wherever they go based on their cell phone. And that can either be legal state-run mobile or web-based applications, or unregulated offshore sites. It is also easier than ever to hide your geolocation, which is usually what's used to restrict access to offshore betting sites. So technologies are making it much easier to gamble anytime, anywhere. Second, we're seeing a worldwide trend of policy liberalization, but here in the US, it's probably best exemplified by the repeal of the Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act. Basically, the repeal of this act made it possible for individual states to introduce legal sports betting schemes outside of Nevada. That is largely thanks to the state of New Jersey appealing to have the repeal to the Supreme Court of the US. And of course, from a financial side, it's very attractive for state governments to introduce betting systems because it generates non-tax state revenues. Of course, it's always very popular for a government to keep tax burden as low as possible, and gambling represents a very large amount of money that can be generated quickly that does not have to come from a tax base. So we're in this period of rapid expansion, but we find that public education is not keeping up with that expansion, especially when we compare it to other addictive products like alcohol and tobacco, right? So I'm sure you've all noticed the massive increase in promotional materials for sports betting in particular, and gambling more broadly, right? It's very hard to watch any kind of sportscast without some mention of gambling or language related to gambling being embedded in that broadcast, right? There's a normalization of gambling language becoming more and more embedded in sports broadcasts. We also see that there's very poor public understanding of the activities that are counted as gambling and the possible harms of gambling, right? My colleagues at the Center for Gambling Studies recently published a survey of social workers, over 2,000 social workers from around New Jersey, and found that of social workers that participate between 2 and 10 forms of gambling, 3/4 claimed that they did not gamble, right? It's a huge inaccuracy of information in the field as to understanding what gambling even is, let alone recognizing its harms. And this is, of course, exacerbated by the fact that there are currently zero federal dollars devoted to gambling research. It's very hard to develop a trusted base of knowledge on gambling activities or problem gambling when there's no federal support. And this it's also very hard to be funded by private foundations as well. I've contacted Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, many large foundations in the US, all told me gambling is not in their interest. They don't consider it part of their purview. So what happens when we have this huge amount of interest in an activity, but very poor distribution of trusted knowledge on that activity? Well, I don't know about you, but when I can't find any good sources of information on a product or a topic, I go to social media. I go to a place like Reddit or Twitter or Facebook. And I think a lot of people are the same. So the factors of increased promotion and poor accurate knowledge pushes people to the internet for sources of information on gambling activities. So here's just a quick map to demonstrate how much sports gambling has spread since 2018, which was the year of the repeal of the Professional Amateur Sports Protection Act. Everyone can see my cursor on the screen here? Great. In 2018, you would have had one small little red state right here. In 3 years, we've had 31 states institute live legal sports betting in the US. Another 5 are have legalized but are not yet operational, and we have several states that have never tried or have failed to legalize gambling. So that's a pretty huge jump in the amount available legal sports betting in US in just 3 short years. So the other side of the coin, besides information, is help seeking. And like any addictive behavior, we find that help seeking is very low among people exhibiting problems with their gambling. It's worse for gambling than it is for things like alcohol use disorder and tobacco use, but of course very low with any kind of addictive disorder. Now, the internet and social media provide some solutions to increasing help seeking, right? Because these forms of help and support can overcome certain barriers that are associated with brick and mortar locations, right? So first, we have a simple convenience issue, right? It's much faster and easier to find support from online than it is from a brick and mortar location where you'll have interference with competing time commitments with work or childcare. Travel distance is very difficult, especially considering how few and far between registered gambling treatment health professionals are. And hours of operation, of course, make it very difficult for people to find face-to-face help off of work hours. There's also issues of cost, right? Of course, there's travel costs still, but poor insurance coverage for treatment of gambling disorders, and even institutions that would be able to cover gambling disorder treatment are not aware of their own capacity or their own interaction with insurance providers. And finally, internet sources are attractive to help seekers because of the anonymity that they can practice in online environments, right? And that avoids the stigma of disclosure, whether to a partner, mental health professional, to anyone they know, right? The ability to kind of manage your identity in an online environment is very attractive in help seekers. So given this background, I, along with some of my colleagues, are following two general research problems. The first is thinking about how people use media to seek support for dealing with problems with gambling, right? And this revolves discussions of help seeking and help seekers sharing what they found useful, what they found unuseful, what they found difficult in trying to seek help in these online environments, and seeing what kind of support people offer each other in social media environments. What does support look like within a social media service? And the second kind of strain of research is looking into the quality of information about gambling that gets shared on social media, right? So this is important for two basic types of information. First, inaccurate understandings of gambling outcomes are associated with increased risk of gambling disorder, right? What we call in gambling research, faulty cognitions. So if you have some kind of error in judgment or in reason that makes you regularly overestimate your odds of winning in a gambling activity, that's associated with increased probability of having problems with your gambling. This includes something like a hot hand fallacy, believing that once a number or a color has been used a certain number of times, that streak will continue. And the classic gambler's fallacy, essentially assuming that past events in a random outcome will affect future events, right? Someone assuming that a coin toss is going to be heads because the last 5 flips were tails, right? Those past events have no bearing on that future event. Those are examples of the kind of faulty cognitions that people enter into. The other type of information we're concerned with are motivations for gambling. We know that people that are motivated to gamble to deal with negative emotional states things like social isolation, heightened states of anxiety or depressive mood. And people who gamble in order to make a profit, they say that the main reason they're gambling is in order to make money, are also at increased risk of gambling disorder, right? People who are gambling expecting to get either some kind of mental health management out of it or to make money are more likely to develop problems. So if we find that social media are perpetuating either faulty cognitions or problematic motivations to gamble, then it could be the case that social media are exposing their users to increased risk of gambling disorder, right? And that's a problem. So we have several research projects on the go here, but they're mostly focused on Reddit. If you're not familiar with Reddit, it's essentially just a very large ongoing collection of message boards where people interact with each other, mostly through chat text, but also, pardon me, through sharing of resources, videos, images, that kind of thing. We've already obtained ethics approval to look at the subreddits our gambling, our problem gambling, our online gambling, our lottery, our sports book, our our poker, and we've had some success in publication with this data too, specifically in computers in human behavior. We have so far used a couple different methods of analysis. The first is interrupted time series analysis. This is essentially looking at the number of posts on a message board and seeing if the shape of those posts is similar before and after a particular date. I'll go through an example in a minute that we found was quite illustrative. As far as the qualitative data goes, there is just a massive amount of data on these message boards. So we need essentially artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques to help us organize this large amount of text. And we're doing this through unsupervised topic modeling, basically ways to help us group and identify themes and vocabulary on these sites, and supervised text classification techniques. Essentially, this means finding examples of emotional motivations or faulty cognitions, and then training a program to find other examples of that online, and then analyzing that corpus of text once we've collected it. And in both cases, we're really interested in variations over time and across message boards, the ones that I've listed above. So here's an example of an interrupted time series analysis. So what we've done here is look at the number of posts per week on the message board Our Problem Gambling. If you're not familiar with Our Problem Gambling, this message board essentially operates like a 24/7 Gamblers Anonymous room. You'll see people sharing stories of their gambling careers. You'll often find themes of rock bottom discussions in there. You'll hear people talk about types of help seeking or strategies that they've used and whether they've been effective or not effective for them. People making daily affirmations as to their day of sobriety on these forums. And some very, very powerful stuff, and of course, a lot of participation. So what we did was look at whether the number of posts on this site looked any different before and after the implementation of sports betting outside of Nevada. Here, the date of June 1st, 2018 is the day that Delaware and New Jersey implemented their online legal sports betting schemes. So if you'll see here, we noticed first that our model showed a significant immediate jump in the number of posts, indicated by the space between these two blue lines. And we saw that the rate of growth on the forum was quite dramatically more rapid after the interruption date. So we saw both an immediate jump and increased growth over time associated very closely with our interruption date. Now, one might say that that could be due to any kind of random number of factors. Maybe Reddit just did a better job of advertising this particular forum or something like that. So we also looked at the qualitative data on these forums, or on this forum, rather. And what we noticed was that when people discuss sports on the Problem Gambling forum before the interruption date, before the legalization of sports betting outside of Vegas, they were talking mostly about European football or European soccer leagues. Of course, these leagues have a very established kind of history with different betting in Europe and especially in the UK. But we noticed after the interruption date was a big increase in discussion of American sports, right? NBA, NCAA tournaments, but especially large with American football, namely the NFL, and in particular, the Super Bowl, right? We started to see posts like the ones below, right? With fewer NFL games on, life is getting a little easier. I managed to stay away, but I nearly relapsed during the conference finals. Not betting on the Super Bowl for the first time in ages will be hard. Or this one, a bit more of a gut punch. I just relapsed on betting on the NFL again. $2,000 gone. I feel so weak and pathetic. Can anyone tell me how to stop? This keeps happening. Thank you for your support. Those were the post content, and we saw a similar pattern in the post titles, right? Day 30, that's the affirmation of the days of sobriety. Almost relapsed on the Super Bowl. Day 24, nightmares of the Super Bowl. Be strong, NFL season starts tomorrow, right? We see here a clear recognition on the forums that all of a sudden these major events in American sports are being discussed as triggers for relapse. We also saw interesting patterns of escalation from sports betting to other kinds of gambling that users found more problematic, in particular blackjack. That was the most common, most reviled form of gambling on the Problem Gambling forum. So here, people discuss in both these posts forms of betting that were not a problem for them. They describe here as careers. We'll take discussions of betting responsibly for years with a grain of salt, but at least in these users' approximation, their sports betting was not a problem for them. But when they moved to blackjack, they all of a sudden were faced with a very dramatic, very serious financial problem from their online gambling. And this is really relevant because many of these sports betting platforms also have online casino platforms in those states where they're available. And what you'll find is things like sign-up bonuses for a sports betting account will come with bonus money to play in the online casino. And this kind of cross-promotion clearly in these vignettes has the ability to kind of capture and increase commitment to gambling among users. Again, based on a wealth of literature, the more forms of gambling a person participates in, the more likely they are to have or develop a disorder. So I'll just go into some of the advantages of the information that we find on social media. And some of these advantages are both for research purposes, but also in anyone who's interested in learning a little bit more about problem gamblers' experiences or gambling behaviors in general. right? First, we find that this data is time-stamped down to the millisecond. If you're a researcher, you'll know how very important this is for longitudinal research. And longitudinal research, of course, is very, very important in trying to establish some kind of relationship of causality over time. So that's a very big advantage you find here that you don't find in survey research, right? Especially given the fact that survey research usually takes a very long time to design, conduct, administer, and then analyze a survey. This data is immediately available to the researcher, of course, pending a successful ethics review. On these forums, we find very rich descriptions of people's gambling careers. From their very first instance of gambling, modeling of their parents gambling on themselves, intersections with other substance use problems, other mental health problems, impacts on their careers, impacts on their relationships, impacts on their mental health. There is such a wide and rich description of people's trajectory within their gambling career and post-gambling careers. Very rich descriptions of what's been successful in recovery, right? A really wide range of strategies and resources for recovery are also discussed on some of these forums of mutual support. We also see a very wide range of experiences. Reddit, for example, has about 50% of its users estimated to be based in the US. That's good for someone trying to get a handle on the American betting context, but it's also possible to see how people in other jurisdictions kind of deal with their gambling, or finding ways to compare people who explicitly recognize her in the US with people who explicitly recognize that they are somewhere else. That can offer some interesting points of contrast for the experiences of gamblers in different places. What's also really nice about these social media data is that they allow for capturing exchange between community members. Right? We have conversations that can span years sometimes if a topic is interesting enough, right? A very kind of deep interaction between users, which is actually very hard to capture in other forms of data. Another kind of often lost population in gambling research is posts by loved ones of those with gambling disorder. There are no small number of people who are asking for advice on either identifying a gambling disorder with a loved one, or how to manage a gambling disorder with a loved one. Very, very interesting, and again, rich descriptions of the experiences of significant others of those with gambling disorders. And of course, the volume of data is gigantic. To just organize this information is a task in itself, but as time goes on, we're getting more and more successful techniques for dealing with this volume, particularly when we're talking about artificial intelligence or machine learning techniques. Those advantages being stated, there are some cautions. Right. First, social media data are not representative of any particular population. It's very important to keep that in mind, right? When half the Reddit users are in the US, we can only really capture huge sweeping policy changes. The example of the repeal of PAPSA was a federal change that was then incrementally implemented by different states. But if you were trying to get any kind of individual state level changes, you're not likely to capture that on Reddit using these data, unless you have a very specific qualitative analysis approach. We also find that different social media sites have very different demographic profiles, right? Reddit, typically dominated by men. Facebook, typically dominated by women. TikTok, usually a much younger age group. Twitter, usually on average, much older in comparison to TikTok. So it's important to know who is using those social media, who you're talking about when you're trying to understand what's going on here. The issue of moderation on these forums is also difficult, right? Again, I'm the most familiar with the Problem Gambling forum on Reddit. The moderator there identifies themselves as a mental health professional who works in gambling disorder and is certified to do so. But it would be very difficult for that one moderator to effectively manage everything that gets posted on that site, right? And there are no such attempts at moderation on the forums that are more promotional of gambling, right? The sportsbook Reddit page, for example, people are not identified as users on that site. It says over 200,000 degens, referring to degenerate gamblers, right? The language of almost glorifying problem gambling or gambling disorder is evident on these forums. There's also the issue of possible impression management with people posting online, right? This is the flip side of the anonymity advantage. Here, because people are able to control the information that they release so easily, it's very difficult to tell when someone's being truthful or accurate in their statements. The ability to engage in impression management is very, very high. And again, you really see this on the sportsbook page, where a huge amount of kind of bravado, projected masculinity comes through on the forum. For people interested in either a kind of applied practice side to using these forums or a research, there are ethical issues with intervention, right? Trying to intervene with someone in one of these forums that displays problem gambling symptoms, for example, that person never sought out professional counsel, right? There's a reason they're on that online environment, and directly messaging them or telling them that they need a counselor and that you are a counselor could be seen as invasive or a kind of violation of someone's kind of privacy. Data collection too, we really have to keep in mind the possible sensitivity of what's being shared on these sites, right? Users do sign off on a user agreement, but who in this room's actually read any of the user agreements that they've been exposed to concerning tech in the last year, right? Probably not a lot of you. It's very important to understand that there's still a trust as the researcher in using those data, and make sure you're kind of protecting the interest of the users. We did another research group that I'm a part of, did a series of interviews with gambling counselors in Ontario, Canada, at the beginning of the pandemic, talking about internet-based interventions. And they identified a few problems with these kinds of media for supporting someone. First, they really recognized a difficulty in developing rapport with someone. And as we mentioned, disclosure of certain kind of details and understanding that you can trust the information that's being given to you at face value, sometimes often depends on developing rapport with that person. They also noticed that there's not a possibility to escalate intervention if someone is either discussing the intention to hurt themselves or others in these kinds of situations, right? There's not an opportunity to engage with someone in a more kind of dire circumstance when all they can do is write a post and sign off immediately. So there are issues there. And then finally, the folks that we had talked to, the counselors we had talked to, noted that generally speaking, the institutions that they worked for did not provide very good support for tech training for practitioners. That generally speaking, especially when we're talking about engaging with people potentially through something like social media, the different organizations likely do not have the capacity to train their professionals in using those kinds of media. So what are some of the kind of big takeaways or implications that we've collected? First, these sources of information, particularly the forums that essentially operate like communities of support for each other, are really great for understanding help-seeking behaviors, right? People go through the harms they experience, their triggers for relapse, the resources they found useful, and the barriers that they experience to finding professional help. There's a very kind of full image of that experience that can be gleaned from these sources of information. I see a lot of value in our proposed research in helping to inform prevention efforts, particularly in correcting misinformation in online forums, right? If our research projects are successful in tracking misinformation or misleading information about gambling, then that will be very useful in developing programs to counter that kind of misinformation, particularly if we're going to be using social media as a form of distributing that information. For people who are just interested in learning more about gambling, about how people talk about gambling, these social media are also great sites. I think it's very important for both researchers and practitioners to have familiarity with the vocabulary or lexicon of gambling to meaningfully engage with people on that topic. And if you want to hear some cutting edge slang about gambling activities, these forums are very, very good sources. Very, very good for familiarizing yourself with the topic and the language involved. And finally, this is more of an end stage product that we're thinking of for our current research, but we really see value in potentially developing early intervention strategies using these social media, right? Developing programs that can identify harmful information and immediately correct that information in situ, right? Someone posts something that, for example, exhibits the gambler's fallacy. We have potentially some kind of bot or a trained professional or a trained worker to flag that post and immediately counter it with correcting information. Using these kinds of sites as a place to provide accurate information where misinformation is presented. Perfect. I know I threw a lot at you there, but I'm happy to take any questions that you might have. I've also got a list of resources here that are relevant to the topics we've talked about today.
Thanks so much, Mark. And as I mentioned earlier, we will share these slides, as long as that's okay with you, Mark, with everybody who has registered for the program. So you'll have access to these resources for further research. And also, Mark, are you okay, before I forget, with sharing your email address with the attendees, in case they have questions for you to follow up?
Yeah, I got it right on that page.
Okay, perfect. Oh, there it is, looking right at it. Well, thank you so much, Mark. So we definitely have some time for Q&A now. There's a small enough group on this call that I think if anybody would like to unmute to ask a question of Mark, you can do that. Or if you're more comfortable just typing your question, you can type it into the chat and I'll just read it out. So any questions for Mark in response to the information presented today. It was a really informative presentation. Mark brought up a lot of really good things. I know I did have some questions that sprung to my mind that I can bring up while we wait for some questions to come in from the audience. I'd like to talk a little bit more about some of the clinical implications that you mentioned, because I think a lot of the folks that are going to be watching this are probably coming from a clinical perspective as opposed to a research perspective. And one of my questions was just about prevalence, and I apologize if you shared some of these stats at the very beginning of the presentation. But I guess my first question is, since the interruption event in 2018 and the legalization in more states, are we seeing an increased prevalence of people developing gambling disorders?
I am very sad to say that we don't really know.
Okay.
As I mentioned earlier, there's very poor support for the kind of research that would collect that information. So when it comes to something like alcohol or tobacco, or a lot of other risky behaviors, including different kinds of substance use, we have yearly survey data on those topics. The BRFIS, the Behavioral and Risk Factors Surveillance System, is a good example of a yearly survey that's conducted in every single state. They don't have any gambling content. When those very few that do, just 2 or 3 states, they don't host it every year. So as far as prevalence rates for the US in general, we have very poor data on whether that's increasing. Now, what you can do is look at state revenues that are exploding right now with gambling and assume that an increased proportion of that is coming from problem gamblers. Previous research has shown that somewhere between 20 and 40% of gambling proceeds come from people with gambling disorders, right? So if you are significantly increasing the money you're taking in, you're also probably significantly increasing the money you're taking from those problem gamblers. We have some data in New Jersey. We are one of the few states that does take good yearly survey data. And while those results haven't been released yet, we are seeing increases in our own survey methods.
Thanks for that, Mark. And I guess, again, I don't know if this is a question that you'll have the data to speak to, but I guess one of the other things that came to mind with the vast increase in online gambling access and digital access to gambling, do we have a sense that this may be impacting youth and teens in a more extensive fashion, considering that they are all digital natives and are living most of their time online at this point?
Most certainly. Our best evidence shows that both online casinos and sports betting, and particularly online sports betting, are forms of gambling that are all favored by younger age groups, most specifically young men between the ages of 18 and 24. It's very likely that these kinds of issues are going to increase rates of problem gambling, more so among younger cohorts than olders, as you mentioned, just given the kind of comfort with the kinds of technologies that they'll be using.
Is there any sense of the racial demographic there as far as what segments may be more highly impacted than others?
Gambling, again, I'm going to go back to that lack of support for quality research, but compared to alcohol use, compared to tobacco use, our understandings of ethnic disparities for gambling is way behind other forms of addictive disorders. And it's going to take serious treatment of gambling as a public health issue. And then in terms, in turn is more relevant to health disparities. And like when it comes down to it, federal dollars devoted to those kinds of research topics.
Thanks, Mark. We have a question in the chat from Awilda. She's just wondering if you have any theories as to why the funders have an appetite for gambling disorder related research.
Right. Well, first, the classification of gambling as on the same tier or kind of disorder with other substance use disorders only happened in the latest version of the DSM. So we have a kind of a categorization problem with the disorder to start with. We also have a disincentive to find out about whether it's harmful or not when we're talking about state funds, in my opinion, to be a little more blunt. But I think a very large problem is that when we think about alcohol, we have throat cancer, we have cirrhosis of the liver. When we think about tobacco, we have lung cancer, we have emphysema. We have no directly attributable health condition that kills a lot of people that we can directly link to a gambling disorder. We do know that odds of death by suicide are greatly increased for people with gambling disorders. We know that alcohol use disorders are greatly increased among people with gambling disorders, but there's a separation between the activity and outcome that I think makes it very difficult for the public to see it as direct or immediate as a threat to public health as other similarly popular addictive products.
Thanks again, Mark, and thank you, Awilda, for your question. Awilda says thank you in the chat as well. I'm just going to take your slides down, or you can take your slides down if that's okay, Mark, just so we can
My pleasure.
Speaking. Other questions for Mark that we may have? I see Daniel's on the screen. Are you trying to speak, Daniel? It looks like you are muted. Or maybe we just can't hear you. Yeah, we can't hear you.
Would it be possible for you to put your question in the chat, Daniel? Thank you.
Thanks. So while we're waiting for Daniel's question to show up, I guess another follow-up question I had with regard to clinical implications. You talked a lot about the way people are talking about gambling now online and on some of these subreddits on social media. So with that in mind, are there any new clinical presentations that you think people might be seeing in treatment, new ways that gambling addictions may be showing up when people enter counseling?
I myself am not a clinician, so I don't have any personal experience to draw from there. I really couldn't say how much that shift from an online to an in-person gambling environment might impact something like the presentation of symptoms or anything like that. What we did find from our interviews with clinicians in Ontario is that clinicians were really interested in using these new and emerging technologies to reach and work with clients, but that there was kind of poor support or poor training to do so. So they were very interested in using it to increase access for people, but that there was some kind of institutional lag in the places where they work to do so effectively.
Yeah, I would definitely be curious to see how research develops on that from a clinical standpoint, because I'm thinking, and also when you're dealing with treatment, with tactics for treatment and trying to help people abstain from gambling, I'm thinking, before 2018, people are going to have to physically go to a casino, or they're going to have to go someplace where they can physically place a bet. And now it's just a matter of going to a website or opening an app and clicking a link. And so I would imagine it's so much easier now for people to engage.
Yeah, the impulsivity question becomes a much greater problem when immediate gratification is possible. I see Daniel has a couple questions here. Thank you, Daniel. So talk more about disabusing public information on misinformation that gambling entities are putting out there. Right. So what we know from some of the successes that we've had in tobacco public education programs is that addressing health promotion problems or putting health promotion information out there is only really successful when it is the dominant message that people are getting. Otherwise, it gets washed out, right? And that only really happens when we start putting restrictions on the kinds of advertisement or promotion that we have for those products. And what we see right now is the Wild West in the US in terms of promoting gambling. If you look at Australia, you look at especially the UK right now, they are really trying to impose new restrictions and claw back their permissive promotion environment now that they're seeing more and more problems with their also exploding gambling market. So I think that the most important aspect of disabusing this misinformation or misleading information is to seriously rein in promotional information and promotional behaviors by gambling providers, right? If you are signing up for a sports betting site and they tell you free bet, match deposit, bonus money, free spins, right? These are all things to make you underestimate your chances of coming out in the hole on these sites. And those are all misrepresentations of your likelihood to win, which we know is a predictor of gambling disorder. So I think that until we have very serious commitments to limit those promotional activities of all sorts, we're going to have a very hard time correcting or identifying those kinds of glamorized images of gambling.
So if I could just interject before you go to Daniel's second question, although I see there's Daniel's comment now, business sports publication. Yeah. So I guess the other question I had following up on that is, do you know if there's any legislative efforts or even stirring of efforts underway in New Jersey to address some of those gambling marketing tactics and trying to claw some of that back?
I do not. I'm not aware of any such legislation efforts or anything like that. If anyone is, please chime in on the chat. But no, I'm not familiar. Oh, thank you, Daniel.
Oh, there we go. A new resolution only on. That's good to know. I'll have to look for that one. I'll try to find information on that bill and include that in the follow-up information I send after the webinar. Sorry. So back to this other. Mark's holding up the bill.
Daniel is, yeah.
I can't see the bill number. Just type the bill number in the chat, please.
Great. Yeah, I guess for Daniel's second question there, how are youth under the age of 21 accessing gambling sites? Are they going to offshore sites mainly? Do we know enough about this? Very, very difficult to say at this point. That is the kind of thing that we will hopefully be looking more into with our survey research here in New Jersey. We are really interested in those questions. But I mean, for some youth, it's the same way that children get scratch tickets at Christmas, right? Their parents give them a credit card number and let them go on a particular website because they're interested in it. I mean, it's more and more restrictions are being put on the ways that you can pay for gambling, particularly on legal sites here in the US. But accessing offshore betting for these kinds of forms of gambling is very, very easy to do. It's really a VPN or an onion router is about all you need, and it's It's $5 a month, and you've got very easy access. So I would say that we don't actually know how often that kind of strategy is happening with our current data.
Thanks, Daniel, for your questions, and Mark for the time to answer those. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we can end a little bit early if we need to, but I'd like to keep the conference going just for another minute or two at least to see if there's any other final questions coming in. I don't see any questions coming in through Facebook. Any final thoughts for Mark before we wrap?
I got most of it in there, but I think right now, I think we have a problem of, particularly in the field of social work, as evidenced by some of the research from my colleagues, one publication that I shared the citation for. People don't know what gambling is and what gambling entails. That there has to be some way of increasing practitioner familiarity with the activity of gambling and the harms that result from it. And for anyone who's kind of interested in just knowing a little bit more about the narratives that these people are experiencing, the course that problem gambling or gambling disorder takes, these social media are very interesting. It's just a great way to familiarize yourself with the everyday struggles that people are experiencing. I know it's opened my eyes quite a bit getting involved with this data.
Well, Mark, thank you so much for this presentation. It was really fascinating. Clearly, there's a lot of work that still needs to be done in the area, a lot of raising of awareness and just getting some folks to start funding some of this research so that we can see the impacts that gambling is having, particularly in these new and digital forms. But with that said, I want to thank everybody for coming today. We'll wrap a couple minutes early. Thank you, Mark, for sharing your expertise with us. And just a reminder to those on the call, our last community conversation of the year is coming up next Monday. We will be having a webinar with the head of philanthropy efforts for the city of Newark, who's going to be talking with us about the Newark economic equality initiative and the effort to bring that pilot program, or sorry, it's already in, the pilot program is there. It's the status of the pilot program a year into the project. So that should be really interesting. That's next Monday at noon. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us, and we'll see you at our next community conversation. Bye, everyone.
Have a great day.